Anything you would just like to close out with for our listeners?
Well, thank you, Scotty. I was about to say I'd be remiss if I didn't share with those believers who are concerned about what would happen if I publicly lived out my faith. And I've discovered that there are 5 things that all believers should know when they face, not if they face, the date where they'll be tested as to whether or not they'll stand for Christ. Not if it happens, but when it happens. The first thing that believers need to understand is that God always prepares his sons and daughters for that moment. You wouldn't be facing that moment if God had not determined that he had properly equipped you for it. That's number 1. Number 2 is the toughest of the 5 lessons. There are worldly consequences for standing on biblical truth and standing for Christ. And when we accept that on the front end, when the moment comes, we're more courageous. When we try to ignore it and then that moment comes, many times we are cowards instead of courageous. So we need to understand and accept the reality. There are worldly consequences for standing on biblical truth and standing for Christ. But we should encourage by the 3rd lesson. There are kingdom consequences for standing on biblical truth and standing for Christ. And the kingdom consequences are always greater than the worldly consequences.
Amen.
The challenge is most believers don't get past number 2 so that they can experience number 3. We allow the fear of the worldly consequences to cause us to bow down rather than rejoicing in the kingdom consequences and standing so that we can get to see the other side, like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, and those other believers. The 4th lesson is when we have the courage and grace to stand, God is glorified in 2 ways. Our enemies get to see a side of God that they would have never seen had we not stood. And the other part is even better. We get to see a side of God that we would not have seen if we had not stood. And the 5th lesson is for the son or daughter of God who has the courage and grace to stand in that moment, their life of blessing goes to a whole nother level that's exceeding abundantly above all they could ever ask or think. We see that in every single case in the Bible, in Job's case, in Daniel's case, in Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego case, Joseph's case, Mary's case, Ruth's case, Esther's case, every person that has courage to stand, God takes their life to a whole nother level. And I'm sitting here today humbly as living proof of the very same truth.
Yeah, that's great. I hope people are taking notes on that. Too often we have this narrow view of what we think life should be. We don't turn it over to God. But when we do, it's just what you said. He abundantly blesses us above what we could ask or think. So why aren't we trying to figure it out? Just be faithful to what he's called us to, exactly like what you said. We think those people in the Bible are just stories that's never going to happen to us. Right. We don't realize if we will do the same things they have done, model our life that way, there's no reason that God won't do the same things for us.
He's the exact same God. And Jesus said it this way. And I just think that when I'm about to say this, I just think of how we just don't believe it. Jesus said, whoever is persecuted for my name, whatever you lose, I will restore it 100-fold. What Jesus was saying is, whatever you lose, I'll restore it to be 100 times greater than what it was you lost. And so he said, if you lose a house, I'll give you a house 100 times better than the one. If you lose your wife or your son or your daughter, I'll restore them, even your kids, 100 times better than the ones that you lost. He said, you will not lose anything standing for me that I will not restore in this life 100 times greater. I'm living proof of that, Scotty.
Amen.
Today, Jesus was not using hyperbole. He was telling the truth.
Very good.